Hi, everybody. It's Jay, and I am back in the booth with you for another sneak peek video preview for this week's new release here on Say with Jay. Our new release this week is The Cowboy's Bargain Bride. It's Book 8 in Jessie Gussman's original Sweetwater Ranch Western Cowboy romance series. And before I get into the audiobook and a preview for you, which I have in just a bit, I wanted to mention something about Jessie's writing. Now, I think you guys know I could talk for days on end about Jessie's writing, but I wanted to focus on just one thing. That is, a lot of times in Jessie's stories, she'll remind us of the power of the verse in Romans 8:28. That's the, in all things, God works for the good of those who love him. And the key word there being all. It's easy to see God's hand in the good things that happen to us. In the trials and challenges and sometimes outright bad things, not so much. And it's hard, especially when I'm not reading Jessie's books, to remember the message of Romans 8:28. And you may be the same way. And I thought it might be good to share the story of Nick Vujicic. Nick is an Australian who was born with a very rare condition called tetraamelia syndrome. He was born with no arms and no legs. Now, Nick, as you can imagine, that must have been just an incredibly difficult childhood and going through his teen years, especially in high school and as a young adult. And he experienced bullying and things like that. And I can't even wrap my head around how hard a life that must have been. And I don't know that I would have had the strength to do anything. But Nick definitely did. And he found this strength through faith. And he specifically mentions Romans 8:28 as one of the core blocks of his faith. And, Nick puts it this way. He said, I can choose to be angry at God for what I don't have, or I can choose to be happy for what I do. What he does have now, because he's chosen to see this trial in his life, he has now become a world-traveled motivational speaker. He's a New York Times best-selling author. He has a ministry called Life Without Limbs, and through that ministry, he has a prison outreach program. He's spoken to stadiums of people about his faith, and he does it with such an immeasurable amount of humor. The man loves to swim. Think about that for a minute. He has no arms and no legs, and he loves to swim. I saw a news report where he encouraged the reporter, while he was swimming, to call him by his other name. The reporter asks, what name? Bob. Come on, that's pretty funny. But that aside, Nick clearly has embraced that God puts everything for our good if we love him. That's just something I saw, and I hoped it might help anybody out there who's struggling through a challenge and can't see where it could go. Now, on to The Cowboy's Bargain Bride. The Cowboy's Bargain Bride is the story of Roxie Petersen, whom we've met previously in this series in The Cowboy's Fairy Tale. She's Ryder Petersen's sister. And Roxie is now faced with her own unique challenge in the will of her deceased uncle, the former owner of the Sweetwater Ranch. Roxie, as a requirement of her uncle's very strange will, in order to inherit the Sweetwater Ranch, she has to auction herself off as a bride to who would become the shared owner, the joint owner of the Sweetwater Ranch with her. It's also the story of Boone Stryker, whom we've met in the previous books. He's one of the Stryker brothers. And Boone and Roxie, through a chance encounter, have an opportunity to perhaps find a future together. I don't want to spoil any more of the story because it is a great one, but I do have a sample for you now, and I hope you'll listen to it, enjoy it, then come back this Friday for the full audiobook release here on Say with Jay. There weren't too many men who could push past the cool facade Roxie Petersen used as a shield. The tall cowboy, with his crisp blue shirt and dark blue daring eyes, hadn't even seemed to notice it. He grabbed her hands and taught her to line dance, like she wasn't giving him her haughtiest attitude. She was glad he had. She'd been trained in formal ballroom dancing and taken 10 years of ballet as a child. It wasn't hard to pick up the steps. She didn't usually have such a magnetic partner. She'd never had a partner like the cowboy who was now beside her, although he hadn't dropped her hand. His fingers were rough and dry as they held hers. Nowhere close to the soft, slightly warm and damp grip she was used to. Brian's hands. She shivered. The cowboy beside her noticed immediately and glanced down, never missing a step. She ignored him. In 2 weeks, she was being sold to the highest bidder, according to the stipulations in her rather eccentric uncle's will. Honestly, she didn't really care. She'd done the married thing. Big fail. How could being auctioned off be any worse? At least that way, she'd keep Sweetwater Ranch, which she'd grown to love, and she'd have a safe, if slightly wild, place to raise her son. The will stipulated she had to auction herself off and get married. It did not stipulate that she had to open her bedroom door to whomever won the auction. Her lawyer had assured her of that much. If he hadn't, she would have given up the ranch, and pride be darned, she'd have gone begging her brother to keep her until she got a job. Although what in the world she'd do was anyone's guess. Teach dance lessons, maybe. The cowboy beside her moved with a fluid grace that was unexpected. He smelled like the big North Dakota sky, full of sunshine and promise. And his grin caused her heart to float like a cloud in that sky. But she wasn't falling for a handsome man with smooth moves and a cute grin. She hoped her heart was paying attention. It jumped every time the man's hand slid across hers. She wasn't free to act on her feelings, even if she wanted to. She'd committed to selling herself and her ranch at the auction in 2 weeks. Come hell or high water, that's what she'd be doing. She stumbled as nerves clutched her insides and the walls of the gymnasium seemed to close in on her. She could do it. She would do it. "Hey, are you okay?" The man's voice, deep and filled with concern, pushed into her consciousness. It eased the tightness in her chest a little, but not nearly enough. She gasped for breath. "I'll be fine. I need to step out for a moment." She expected to slip away from him and duck out the side door behind them, into the darkened hallway and the restroom around the corner. But she didn't have a chance to slip away because he pulled her to the small door. Her heart pounded in her chest, and blood swished through her ears. She needed to get out, get some space, get a hold of herself. She'd been married before and survived. Brian had turned out to be a stranger after their marriage. The auction wasn't something she hadn't already been through. But she hadn't had Spencer. The door clacked. She barely noticed when he pulled her out. The hallway, dark and cool, helped her heated body and racing heart immediately. The cowboy still held her hand, but he didn't impose on her space. She took slow, deep breaths, knowing the ball of wire in her stomach would loosen soon. Most of the time, she was fine, knowing that a serial killer was unlikely to have the money necessary to buy her ranch. And her. It would be a hard-working man. Probably an older one who'd had a lifetime to accumulate the necessary cash. He probably wouldn't even be interested in a wife, and marrying her would be something he had to do to get Sweetwater. Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out the playlist with all our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.